Hi, do you think the United States immigration is a bit of a mess? I think it is, and I also think I know why. That's because a lot of people have strong opinions, but with a very limited scope of perspective. I like to present to you 7 perspectives based on my own experiences by talking to various people, both officers, other immigrants, and people locally where I've lived. I hope this will help you find a way to find a solution. My name is Telluselle, and here we go. First, a little about my background. I'm a copywriter and a life coach in Sweden, where I was born. However, I visited the United States several times during the years, and I even was an exchange student already when I was 17 in upstate New York. In later years, I've been on and off to Honolulu in Hawaii, where I studied at university there. And in 2010, I went again with a valid F1 visa to finish my master's degree, I hoped. I had no criminal convictions and I entered the country legally. I passed 2 semesters with passing A grades without any difficulties, but I couldn't continue studying because my Swedish university didn't transfer the credits to my American university, and my American university didn't approve of these credits on time for me to continue registering on time. Therefore, this becomes a delay. And therefore, I ran out of student loan and I became what is referred to as out of status. I didn't lose my visa status, but I was out of status because I wasn't studying full time in 2011. I tried to get temporary work authorization, which is allowed according to the visa, and you can get that due to financial hardship or simply after staying in the country for 9 consecutive months and being able to so forth, giving yourself some more time to study and to gain money back so you can continue paying and living, which is kind of expensive because the student loan isn't covering everything, and we don't really get to know that until we enter the country. However, the school never signed those approvals for temporary work authorization, so I was kind of stranded for a while. Therefore, I became detained by ICRO and I received volunteer departure, but didn't have any money to neither bond out or to take the ticket. And I also already started doing this thing, and I wanted to stay in the United States. So I figured, if I invest in myself, both time and financially, I have a right to receive my certificate, if not my whole passing grade and my whole degree. So I appealed my cases, but I was still deported. During this time, I collected a whole lot of evidence, a whole lot of different witness testimonies, and all my legal papers to see what it is that was actually wrong and how this could change. After all, I was a student in organizational change. I have concluded that we can look at the U.S. immigration from 7 different perspectives. We have the USCIS and embassies perspective, we have the immigrants' perspective, we have the sponsors' perspective, we have the public's perspective, then we also have ICE's perspective and the court's perspective, and finally the organizational culture, which is all how this works and how it all binds together. First, we have the USCIS and embassies perspective. Most people are required to apply for a visa before entering the country. It's very hard to get it approved while you're in the country, and that is usually only for asylum seekers or someone who has been a victim to a crime by an American offense. However, most people go to the consulate or to the embassy, and some people also send it in directly to USCIS, who are the ones approving of the visa. Only 7% of the total population of a country is allowed a visa. The number of refugees allowed in is set by President and Congress, and that varies depending on what United Nations suggests and recommends, and of course what is happening in the world, whether we have natural disasters or any political wars or simply having a depression that we need to deal with. Most visas also require a sponsor. A sponsor is someone who is signing the application with you to make sure that you can have a relationship in the United States. This can be a spouse, it can also be an employer or a university. Next is the immigrant's perspective, and also my own. We see visas as a permit to live in the United States. We don't think of it as a continuing relationship that we have to uphold. We think of it as a way to start beginning our lives that we seek to become better than we had before. However, we also need and depend on a sponsor, and the sponsor is the one requiring us to do certain things to uphold our part of the visa. We also need to work at least for 5 consecutive years to be included in benefits. Nobody goes to the United States and gets social welfare or any other kind of healthcare benefit day one. Nobody does. Sometimes refugees can get help with that, but no student, no regular green card holder, no employment visa, no other type of girlfriend-boyfriend visa gets any kind of benefits whatsoever. We all are required to have our own insurances with us, that most of us do. So we want a better life, but we also have limited resources, which is why it's so important that we are allowed to work, or at least try to work, while we are here. And of course, we are also vulnerable to different offenses, which can make our visas revoked, even if we have remedies that people can become a victim and still get another kind of visa, which is called a U visa. However, in most cases, those visas are also denied. And we know that we can become deported, but we don't really know how or who or what's going to happen, because we just see people in blue uniforms. Later we realize that it's Customs Border Patrol who questions you at the border. We have the ERO part inside ICE that can question us and deport us within the country. And we also know that all belongs under Department of Homeland Security. But none of that is told at the embassy. What's the sponsor's perspective then? Well, most Americans are immigrants, and we all like to be helpful to other immigrants because that's the history of the United States. However, most Americans don't want to sign anything because they all think that maybe you should get a visa first, and then you can get a job with me, or then we can get married, and then you can start studying, or whatever, starting a business. But sometimes people do try to be helpful, and sometimes sponsors do try to sign something for you. But the sponsor is also held financially responsible for the immigrant, and the sponsor at the same time can be abusing his or her power over the immigrant's visas, trying to provoke the immigrant to do certain things, which can even lead to trafficking. The most important perspective to consider, however, is the public's perspective. What does the American public think of immigration, visas, deportations, and so forth? Well, most of people think that all criminal offenses is supposed to be used to deport someone, even though most of the inmates in the United States are regular Americans. They don't want to take responsibility for sponsoring someone's visa, and most think that everybody is trying to get benefits or even the right to vote, when neither is allowed or paid out, only to refugees for refugee help, and not at all any votes. Nobody is allowed to vote unless you're an American citizen. Sometimes green card holders are allowed to vote locally in your city and county, but not nationally. And that is only if you've paid your taxes. But the most biggest problem is that the majority of the public think that all immigrants without visas are illegal and criminal. This, however, is not true. Let's turn to ICE. ICE stands for Immigration Customs Enforcement, and the way it is organized was becoming this way after 9/11, when the Department of Homeland Security was instated to ensure that the United States were not going to have to endure any more terror attacks. However, most immigrants are not at all trying to become terrorists. All detained immigrants should be deported regardless. It's usually what ICE assumes. They don't want to take any responsibility for anyone who was wrongfully detained, and detentions and deportations are all up to court, so they put it all onto them without taking any responsibility for what they're doing themselves. They assume that all immigrants should be treated as criminals, but they also know that it's only an administrative measure. All the courts that handles immigration cases are called administrative courts and not criminal. Some countries refuse to accept deportees, And that enables the person, even if it was a criminal, even if it was an aggravated felony even, become released back into the American society without any problem because the country that it was coming from is refusing to accept it back. And ICE can also issue green card sometimes if it's based on supervision. So, what happens in court? The court's perspective is that you can have no appointed attorney, but you can pay for your own if you want to. We try your case, but it usually is only for the record, and meanwhile, if you're detained, you have to wear your prison suit and simply stand in your handcuffs through a camera. They can issue a bond, but they cannot allow you to work, meaning that you cannot sustain your own living financially unless you're living off someone else while you're out and released on bond. If you're detained, you're seen as a criminal, even though 65% had no criminal convictions and 93% had no violent criminal convictions, according to the Cato Institute as of June 2025. The final decision to deport, however, is up to the discretion of ICE. So does it even matter whether or not the court fights for voluntary departure or deportation? So, for any organizational change to happen, we have to look at the organizational culture and try to change that first. The organizational culture of ICE and CBP and everything that has to do with Department of Homeland Security and sometimes also do with the court is always hierarchical, like the military. Most wear a uniform of some sort, and most people say, don't take it personally, I'm just doing my job. And that kind of culture is taking away their own empowerment from the people working as officers, as well as not taking responsibility in a nice and positive way for helping people stay the right way with a renewed visa, for example. They works in the same way regardless of which president is president. Regardless if it is a Democrat, regardless if it's a Republican, it's been the same exact way after 9/11. And the organizational culture strives to fulfill a specific set quota that the White House has set. And all detained immigrants are still treated as criminals. They even said that they assume that all people who are inmates, regardless if you're an immigrant or an American, is that you probably have committed some kind of crime that was even worse than the one you're in for. Now that kind of view on people is creating this culture where all this become a view of seeing the immigrants as criminals even if they are not at all. And how would you feel if you were becoming detained in a country without an attorney, without committing a crime, without even having any type of help to get you out of there, without knowing how long you're going to stay, and even being locked up in isolation for a while? That is what's happening in the United States. But there are always solutions. First of all, we have to refuse any recalcitrant countries to deny repatriations together with the United Nations. No country should be allowed to say no to someone who was a citizen to be able to return to that country. That is a given. We have to treat every immigrant as an individual and not a representative of his or her home country, so that it doesn't become a political battlefield depending on where you're from, but simply looking at your own specific case. And to make sure that this becomes treated equally, the best thing would be to allow everybody a free 3-month stay, the way, for example, Europeans are allowed. And most importantly, we need to change detentions to halfway housing or YMCAs, where the immigrant is not going to be locked up the way they are in a prison, unless they have already been committing a crime that they have a conviction for. Most cases aggravated felonies, but overall simply an actual criminal conviction. Then that person can be staying in prison, meanwhile the immigration proceedings are continued. Otherwise, to move the people out of detention centers and put them somewhere where they have guards, where they have curfews, but that are also allowed to use the phone, to use the computer, to talk to attorneys, and most of all, to apply for a new visa. Sometimes people just need to renew it. Sometimes they need to change the conditions. For example, if someone was married, got divorced, got married again, then maybe they just need to switch the name of the green card. That's a simple thing that can take maybe 5 or 6 weeks to administrate, but instead that person ends up sitting in an American prison cell for not 6 months, a year, just because you cannot be allowed to step out on the street and find the right form to fill out. That is ridiculous. Most of all, if we allow immigrants to apply for visas directly with the USCIS without any sponsorships, but instead just report their whereabouts, their taxes, their addresses, and make sure that that is done regularly. A, you will have control over who is working and living where, and B, there won't be this kind of neither abuse nor dependence or conflicts with any sponsor or who is going to take responsibility for signing this or that application. But instead it becomes a relationship between the United States and the immigrant directly. First of all, to be able to do that, we have to open up our attitudes to make sure that the immigrant can contribute to society and looking for that rather than assuming that everybody are criminals. And speaking of which, is it a good or bad thing to have a wall? Of course it's a good thing. Nobody wants to live in an unsafe home. If you look at the whole country as a home, it's natural to have a good wall securing the border to make sure that nobody gets in that shouldn't get in, but also to make sure that people trying to get in won't become hurt during their way towards that. So, this is how we solve the U.S. immigration. To learn more about the specifics of my case and other cases, you can read the book, The Call for Divine Fathering, Flying with the Feathers of the Eagle, in my search for safety. There are witness testimonies inside that book that were submitted and investigated by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva in 2014 to 2016 in working groups with representatives from the various different countries. And the conclusion of that was the United States needs to stop the arbitrary detentions of immigrants. To find out more about me, you can look at my webpage, telluselle.com, and don't hesitate to send me an email to see if we can come up with even more solutions to solve this. Thank you for listening.